Okay, hello again. We're going to continue our conversation on media, and we'll go through different media one by one. And we're going to start out with print media because basically it is the oldest media that exists, and we'll kind of go through this in a sequential way from one to the other. But print media, of course, is words on a printed page, and we'll start out with that. And before newspapers or books could be printed, books were copied by hand. And this is a laborious process, as you can imagine. And what that meant was that there weren't very many books. But this was the way that information was preserved and passed down from one person to another and from generation to generation for a very long time. So let's have a look at a video on books being copied by hand.
The structure of a medieval manuscript. For more than 1,000 years, all books were written and illustrated by hand. By the Middle Ages, books were being made by taking sheets of parchment, folding them in half, and arranging them into short stacks called gatherings. Gatherings were joined side by side, sewn at the book's spine, and attached to covers to protect the book's content.
Okay, we'll stop that there. This is a fairly short video, but you can watch the rest of it on your own if you like. But you get the idea. Perhaps the most famous such book is called the Book of Kells, and it is at the Trinity University Library in Dublin, Ireland, and was copied by monks in Ireland. And people come from all the world over to see this book. So let's look at a short bit of a video here on the Book of Kells.
Why do more than 1 million people every year come to look at a 1,200-year-old book? Welcome to this course on the Book of Kells from Trinity College Dublin. I'm Dr. Rachel Moss from the Department of History of Art and Architecture.
And I'm Dr. Fáinne Ryan from the Loyola Institute of Theology at Trinity.
And together with our colleagues from the library at Trinity, over the next 4 weeks, we'll be exploring one of Ireland's most famous manuscripts. The Book of Kells sits in a darkened room encased in protective glass in the old library here at Trinity College. It's regarded as one of the greatest cultural treasures of Ireland and described by some as the most famous manuscript in the world.
I'm going to stop that there, but I will pull this back just for a moment. You can see that, of course, the words, the sentences were copied by hand, but you can also see that the book is very elaborately illustrated by the monks who copied it, and this was one of the things that made that particular book and many books like it that were copied by hand considered to be artistic treasures because of the illustrations that were so diligently and beautifully done by the learned men who copied those books. But obviously, this is a very labor-intensive and time-consuming process. So printing finally was developed, and the ability to print one copy of whatever it might be at a time had existed. But Johann Gutenberg in 1450 made one of the great, not discoveries, but inventions of all time. And it compares to the internet in our own time, and maybe even surpasses the internet when you realize where we were before the movable press, movable type printing press, and then where we were after that. I say we just being the world in general. So Gutenberg's movable type press permitted high-quality reproduction of printed materials at a rate of nearly 4,000 pages a day, which would not be very much today, but it was 1,000 times more than what could be done by hand. And in particular, the Gutenberg Bible is the thing that Gutenberg is most famous for. One of the most famous and consequential publications of all time, the first mass-produced book, and had a tremendous amount of influence on the world and a tremendous amount of influence in terms of leading people to become literate, to be able to read and write. So let's have a look at this on Gutenberg's printing press.
Hand or made using block printing. Movable metal typeset printing is one of the greatest inventions of the last millennium. It revolutionized the way people created and produced books. But what exactly is movable typeset, and why was it such a big deal? Before the movable type printing press was invented, books were expensive and either copied by hand or made using block printing. Copying books by hand was tedious and time-consuming, and scribes sometimes made copying errors. Block printing meant that text and images had to be carved into blocks of wood, then covered with ink and stamped onto a page. These blocks were time-consuming to create and use. By 1450, less than 30,000 books existed in all of Europe. All of this would change with the innovations of Johannes Gutenberg. In the late 1390s, Johannes Gutenberg was born into an upper-class family in Mainz, Germany. He learned various crafts like blacksmithing, jewel cutting, and goldsmithing. Around 1450, he began developing new techniques for improving the printing press. Gutenberg created a process using movable metal type, which meant that letters could be rearranged into countless patterns. This was faster and more accurate than any previous method. It made books and tracts much more affordable. Gutenberg's first major project was printing the Bible in Latin. By 1500, there were over 200 printing shops in Europe. It is estimated that between 8 and 20 million books were printed during those first 50 years. This type of printing press would lead to the mass production of the Bible. This meant that the Bible was more accessible and affordable to people than ever before. The effects of Gutenberg's invention were enormous. Ideas spread across Europe and the world faster than they ever had. This contributed to major cultural and intellectual movements such as the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. Printed books, including the Bible, were more affordable for everyone. Gutenberg's innovations revolutionized the process of book production and the way people engaged with the Bible.
Okay, so there's a part of what he discusses in that video. About 30,000 books existed in Europe before Gutenberg invented the movable type press, and within a few years, they don't have an exact estimate, but somewhere between 8 and 20 million books existed. So this vastly increased the number of books being printed, and therefore the accessibility of books to people, increasing the amount of knowledge by a phenomenal amount. And then you saw the Renaissance and the other periods of advancement that came from the printing press. There's a couple of other videos there. If we were in a classroom, I would take some time to show those to you. I think they're very good. So have a look at those as well. At least some of them, if you like. By the way, you will find at the end of the second part of these outlines will be some notes. And the notes primarily are bits of information that come from the videos and that be helpful for you to know and to have access to when time comes for a test. So just be aware that there are some notes at the end of the second part of these outlines that'll be helpful to you. First, weekly newspapers in Germany come along in 1609, so roughly not quite 200 years. Takes a while for things to evolve and to develop, but not quite 200 years after the invention of the movable type printing press. Then the first American, and this was a colonial newspaper because the United States had not been founded under the Constitution as yet. So the first American newspaper, 1690. And then James Franklin published the New England Courant in 1721. And the reason I mainly bring this up is that later that would be taken over, the publishing of that newspaper would be taken over by his younger brother, a fellow you may have heard of named Benjamin Franklin. And then later Ben Franklin published a paper that is better known than the New England Courant, and that's the Pennsylvania Gazette, and a very, very influential publication in the United States. 1733, don't worry too much about dates. It's more important that you understand the importance of the events. But in 1733, John Peter Zenger was the publisher of the New York Weekly Journal, obviously in New York City. He was arrested for criticizing the colonial governor who had been appointed by the king, William Cosby. It should be just William, not Williams, but William Cosby. And so Zenger went on trial for sedition, which is causing a rebellion against the government, and for libel, but was found not guilty of sedition and libel. And this, even before the United States government was created, this very early on established the principle of freedom of the press. So let's look at a video on the John Peter Zenger trial, 1733.
Before the Constitution established the First Amendment, English and colonial assemblies considered freedom of the press a danger to the state. But colonial newspapers vigorously defended their freedom. They insisted that citizens had a right to monitor and criticize their governments. In 1735, this right was tested by John Peter Zenger, a German-born printer.
John Peter Zenger was a newspaper editor in New York Colony in the 1730s who published editorials lambasting the governor.
Sir William Cosby, the governor of New York at the time, was the object of Zenger's harsh editorials.
And the governor ordered him arrested for sedition and libel, and his paper closed. And in fact, some issues of his paper were publicly burned. Zenger was put on trial for sedition, that is, bringing the governor into disrepute. Zenger insulted the governor, no question about it. He called him a thief, a crook, a criminal. And yeah, that's against the law. It was definitely against the law. But he said, if you think he was right, truth should be a defense against that. His trial is important because his lawyer convinced the jury that Zenger was right, that the governor was a lowlife. And so the jury acquitted him.
The Zenger case proved that Americans valued a free press, an idea that would become law with the creation of the Constitution.
Okay, so they're referring there to the First Amendment of the Constitution, which we'll be talking more about in the near future, very near future, and again at some other points in the case. So the John Peter Zenger trial, an important milestone in establishment of what we now refer to as freedom of the press, and which is part of the First Amendment. 1791, the U.S. adopted the First Amendment as part of the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. That did not mean that there were no challenges to freedom of the press going forward. In 1798, under President John Adams, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which declared that writing, printing, uttering, or publishing any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States was illegal and could be cause for someone to be sent to prison. So basically, under the Alien Act was these were really two different things, but they're referred to as the Alien and Sedition Acts. But the main part of this has to do with, again, this idea of sedition, that you're causing a rebellion to start. And basically, it was illegal to say anything critical about government officials, whether it was true or not. So it's one thing if you're being sued for or prosecuted for libel, that you said something false and deliberately false, knowingly false against a government official or anyone else. But it's another thing to say that you cannot publish any kind of criticism at all of a government official. So this did not last very long. I'm going to show you a video here on the Alien and Sedition Acts.
As the 18th century was coming to a close, the nation experienced its first crisis in freedom, a freedom it had wrested from Great Britain 17 years earlier, freedom of press and speech. The framers of the Constitution understood that monarchs and tyrannies maintained power by prohibiting any criticism of their rule. So the framers explicitly provided for open criticism of the government through the First Amendment. Still, there have always been those tempted to abuse the power of the federal government. The first time arose in 1798 after France and Britain had renewed their centuries-old conflict. The Federalists sided with Britain and the Republicans supported France. Led by John Adams, the Federalists attempted to restrict criticism aimed at their policies by their Republican rivals. In the summer of 1798, a Federalist-dominated Congress passed some of the most repressive measures ever enacted by the U.S. government. Two Alien Acts directly targeted immigrants thought to be sympathetic with Republican ideals, making it harder for those aliens to become citizens and giving the president power to deport anyone considered dangerous to the welfare of the country. The Sedition Act directly targeted Republican political activity. The act fined and imprisoned anyone conspiring with any intent to oppose any laws of the government or presenting opposition through
printing, writing, or speaking in a scandalous or malicious way against the government of the United States, either House of Congress or the President, with the purpose of bringing them into contempt.
The majority of the American public so roundly hated the Alien and Sedition Acts that they turned the Federalists out of office by electing Thomas Jefferson in 1800. The new Republican government, led by Jefferson, repealed the Alien Acts and allowed the Sedition Act to expire, ending a dark era in American history.
Okay, that's not far from being done, but I will go ahead and stop it there in the interest of time, and you can watch the rest of it if you want to. So as he says there at the near the end of the video, when Thomas Jefferson came into office as president, the Alien and Sedition Acts were rescinded, and so they were only in effect for very few years, 2-3 years, something like that, and ended under Thomas Jefferson. So that's some of the early background on newspapers, printing, and in particular newspapers, print media. And we're going to continue this conversation, and we'll see you next time.